Mrs. Clinton, you asked me what I know about foreign policy. Let me tell you what I know. Vice President J.D. Vance's voice was steady, almost conversational, but the words landed like hammer blows in the silent Senate chamber. I know that on September 11th, 2012, 4 Americans were killed in Benghazi while you were Secretary of State. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. 4 Americans who served their country and died because your department denied their requests for security. Hillary Clinton sat at the witness table, her expression frozen. The confident smirk she had worn for the past hour was gone. In its place was something she rarely showed in public: uncertainty. The air in the chamber felt heavy, oppressive. Every eye was fixed on the vice president. No one moved. No one coughed. The usual shuffle of papers, the whispered conversations between aides, the quiet buzz of a room full of people, all of it had stopped. There was only Vance's voice, calm and relentless, and the documents spread before him like evidence at a trial. Hillary's hands, usually so expressive, so carefully choreographed for the cameras, lay flat on the table. Her fingers were pressed against the wood, not moving, as if she were trying to anchor herself to something solid. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes, sharp and calculating moments ago, now darted briefly to her notes, then to her attorney beside her, then back to Vance. She was looking for an escape route. There wasn't one. I know that your department received over 600 requests for additional security in Libya in the months before that attack. 600 requests. And I know that those requests were denied. Some of them bear your signature. Vance held up a document. The paper was plain, unassuming, but the words printed on it were damning. Hillary could see it from where she sat. She recognized the format, the header, the seal of the State Department. She had seen thousands of documents like it during her tenure. This one, however, she wished she had never seen. I know that on the night of the attack, you sent an email to your daughter, Chelsea. You wrote, "2 of our officers were killed in Benghazi by an Al-Qaeda-like group." Al-Qaeda. You knew that night, within hours of the attack, that it was terrorism. He set down the email. The chamber remained silent. Hillary's attorney leaned toward her, whispered something. She didn't respond. She was staring at Vance now, her face a mask, but behind the mask something was cracking. And then you went before the American people and blamed a YouTube video. You told the families of the dead at the funeral, standing next to their coffins, that you would bring the filmmaker to justice. Not the terrorists who actually killed their sons. The filmmaker. Vance leaned forward. His eyes never left Hillary's face. Patricia Smith, Sean Smith's mother, says you looked her in the eye and promised to prosecute the man who made that video. She says you lied to her face while her son's body was lying in a flag-draped coffin 10 feet away. His voice hardened. Is that enough foreign policy experience for you, Mrs. Clinton? Or should I continue? Because I have 40 years of your experience right here in these folders, and I'm happy to go through all of it. Hillary's mouth opened, but no words came out. 3 hours earlier, she had walked into this chamber expecting to deliver a masterclass in political destruction. She had planned to humiliate the hillbilly vice president on national television, to remind everyone why she should have been president, to demonstrate that she was still the most formidable figure in American politics. Instead, she was watching her entire legacy burn. 3 hours earlier, Hillary Rodham Clinton had swept into the Senate chamber like visiting royalty returning to reclaim her throne. She wore a powder blue pantsuit, her signature armor, and walked with the measured confidence of someone who had spent 40 years in the arena. Her entourage followed: former staffers, loyal donors, media allies who had covered her career since Arkansas. They formed a protective constellation around her, a reminder that Hillary Clinton was not just a witness at a Senate hearing. She was an institution. The hearing was officially titled American Leadership in a Changing World: Challenges and Opportunities. Hillary had been invited to testify as a former Secretary of State, to share her insights on foreign policy, to offer her wisdom to a new generation of leaders. That was the official reason anyway. The real reason was politics. Senate Democrats wanted Hillary on the national stage. They wanted her gravitas, her experience, her ability to dominate a room. and they wanted her to eviscerate J.D. Vance. The vice president had been presiding over the Senate more frequently lately, attending committee hearings, engaging with witnesses. Democrats saw an opportunity. Put Hillary Clinton in a room with the hillbilly-turned-VP and watch her tear him apart. The clips would be devastating. The contrast would be perfect. The experienced stateswoman versus the inexperienced pretender. Hillary had been eager to accept. She still burned over 2016. She still believed she had been robbed by Russia, by Khmer, by sexism, by the deplorables who couldn't see her obvious qualifications. And now one of those deplorables was Vice President of the United States. J.D. Vance, the man who had called Trump America's Hitler and then become his running mate. The man who had written a book blaming poor people for their own poverty. The man who represented everything Hillary despised about the new Republican Party. The populism, the nationalism, the rejection of the establishment order she had spent her life building. She was going to destroy him. Her staff had prepared extensively. They had compiled every contradictory statement Vance had ever made. They had analyzed his book for weaknesses. They had crafted lines designed to go viral. You've written about poverty, Mr. Vice President, but you've never actually done anything about it. You called your own candidate reprehensible. What does that make you for serving him? Hillary had rehearsed in front of mirrors, in front of aides, in front of friendly journalists who promised to amplify the best moments. She knew exactly how to deliver condescension as concern, how to make an opponent look small while appearing gracious herself. She had been doing this for 40 years. J.D. Vance had been in politics for barely 4. What Hillary didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she was walking into an ambush. Vice President Vance had known about her plans for weeks. A source inside the Democratic caucus, troubled by the naked politicization of a policy hearing, had leaked the strategy. Vance knew exactly what attacks were coming. He knew the lines Hillary had prepared. He knew the clips she was trying to create. And he had decided to let her try. Let her attack, he had told his chief of staff. Let her lecture me about experience and qualifications. Let her be as condescending as she wants. His chief of staff had been confused. Sir, she's going to eviscerate you on national television. She's been doing this for 40 years. Vance had smiled. She's been getting away with things for 40 years. That's different. And every attack she makes on me is going to open a door. A door to Benghazi, to the emails, to the foundation, to Bill's accusers, to the dossier, to 40 years of scandals she's never been held accountable for. He had opened a thick binder on his desk, the result of months of preparation. She's going to attack my inexperience, but her experience is a 40-year record of failure and scandal. She's going to attack my book, but I wrote honestly about poverty. She got rich from public service through pay-to-play. She's going to call me a misogynist, but she spent decades destroying women who accused her husband. She's going to call me a hypocrite for supporting Trump, but she's the one who paid for fake opposition research and pushed a hoax for 4 years. Vance had closed the binder. Hillary Clinton thinks she's untouchable. She thinks the rules don't apply to her. She's been getting away with it for so long she's forgotten that the evidence is all still there, documented, on the record, waiting for someone to bring it up. He had looked at his staff. Today, someone's going to bring it up. Hillary Clinton took her seat at the witness table with the practiced ease of someone who had testified before Congress dozens of times. She arranged her papers, adjusted her microphone, and surveyed the chamber with an expression of serene confidence. The room was packed. Every seat was filled. Senators, staffers, media, spectators. This was the most anticipated congressional hearing in months. The cameras were rolling. The stage was set. Chairman Menendez welcomed her with effusive praise. Secretary Clinton, thank you for joining us today. Your decades of service to this country as First Lady, as Senator, as Secretary of State give you a unique perspective on the challenges facing American foreign policy. We're honored to have you here. Hillary nodded graciously. Thank you, Chairman Menendez. It's always a privilege to appear before this committee. She glanced toward the presiding chair where Vice President Vance sat quietly reviewing documents. He hadn't looked up when she entered. He seemed completely absorbed in his papers, as if the most famous woman in American politics wasn't sitting 20 feet away. Hillary's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized the tactic, appeared disinterested, refused to acknowledge the opponent's importance. She had used it herself many times, but she also saw it as weakness. He was afraid to engage. He knew he was outmatched. She would show him just how outmatched. Chairman Menendez invited her to make an opening statement. Hillary leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today to discuss American leadership in a rapidly changing world. But before I address the specific policy questions before this committee, I feel compelled to address the broader context in which we find ourselves." She paused, her expression growing grave. American leadership is not a given. It must be earned, maintained, and defended. It requires experience. It requires judgment. It requires a deep understanding of how the world works and how America can shape it for the better. Our gaze drifted toward Vance, who was still reviewing his papers. Unfortunately, we live in an era when experience is devalued, when expertise is dismissed, when people with no understanding of the complexities of global affairs are placed in positions of enormous responsibility. Vance still didn't look up. "I've spent 40 years in public service. I've sat across from world leaders on every continent. I've negotiated treaties, managed crises, represented this country in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I've made hard decisions with imperfect information, knowing that lives hung in the balance." Now she turned directly toward Vance. "So I hope the Vice President will forgive me if I'm somewhat skeptical of those who believe that writing a memoir qualifies them to be a heartbeat from the presidency." A ripple of reaction went through the chamber. This was what everyone had come to see. Vance looked up from his papers. His expression was mild, almost pleasant. "Please continue, Mrs. Clinton. I'm listening." Hillary smiled, the smile of a predator who had just spotted wounded prey. "Thank you, Mr. Vice President, I will." For the next 45 minutes, Hillary Clinton delivered a masterclass in political condescension. She didn't attack Vance directly at first. She was too sophisticated for that. Instead, she lectured about the importance of experience, about the dangers of populism, about the need for serious people to guide American foreign policy. Every point was an implicit criticism of Vance, but delivered with the appearance of statesmanlike wisdom. "The world is watching America," she said. "Our allies are wondering if they can trust us. Our adversaries are probing for weakness. And in this moment of maximum danger, we need leaders who understand the weight of the decisions they're making." She discussed her tenure as Secretary of State, the reset with Russia, glossing over its failure, the intervention in Libya, glossing over its consequences, the pivot to Asia, glossing over its incompleteness. She presented herself as the steady hand, the experienced operator, the adult in the room. Then came the direct attacks. "Mr. Vice President, I've read your book, Hillbilly Elegy. It's an interesting personal story, but I couldn't help noticing that your prescription for poverty was essentially to blame the poor for their circumstances. Personal responsibility, you called it." She shook her head with practiced disappointment. "That's a convenient philosophy for those who have escaped poverty, but it does nothing for those still trapped in it. You wrote about your community's problems, Mr. Vice President. What have you actually done to solve them?" Vance made a note on his legal pad, but said nothing. "And then there's your rather dramatic political evolution. I remember 2016 quite well, as you might imagine. And I remember some of the things you said about Donald Trump." She pulled out a sheet of paper. "You called him America's Hitler. Your words, not mine. You said he was noxious and reprehensible, and you said he was leading the white working class to a very dark place." She looked up. Strong words, principled words, one might even say. And yet here you are 4 years later, his vice president, his loyal servant, defending everything you once condemned. Hillary spread her hands in a gesture of bewilderment. "What happened, Mr. Vice President? Did you have a genuine change of heart? Or did you simply decide that principles were less important than power? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the latter. It looks like you said whatever was necessary to advance your career, regardless of what you actually believed." She leaned forward. "That's not leadership. That's opportunism. and the American people deserve better. Vance continued to take notes. His expression remained neutral. Hillary pressed on, energized by his silence. Your views on foreign policy are particularly concerning. Your skepticism about supporting Ukraine, our democratic ally fighting against Russian aggression, echoes the worst isolationist impulses of the past. You would abandon our partners. You would hand Eastern Europe to Vladimir Putin. You would undo 70 years of American leadership in the world. And for what? To please a base that doesn't understand the complexities of international relations. To score political points with people who can't find Ukraine on a map. She shook her head again. This is what happens when inexperience is elevated to the highest levels of government. This is what happens when we abandon the bipartisan consensus that has kept the world safe since World War II. This is what happens when populism replaces expertise. Hillary straightened in her chair, preparing for her conclusion. Mr. Vice President, I don't doubt your intelligence. I don't doubt your ambition. But intelligence and ambition are not the same as wisdom and experience. You've never managed a crisis. You've never negotiated with a foreign adversary. You've never made a decision knowing that American lives were on the line. She gestured around the chamber. I have. For 40 years I have. And that's the difference between us. That's why your presence in the office you hold is so deeply troubling to those of us who understand what's at stake. She sat back, satisfied with her performance. I hope you'll take these concerns in the spirit they're offered, as honest counsel from someone who has seen what inexperience can cost. The world is watching, Mr. Vice President. I hope you're ready for the weight of that responsibility. She folded her hands and waited for the applause she knew was coming from the Democratic side of the chamber. It came. Senators Warren and Booker were practically beaming. The media gallery was typing furiously. Hillary destroys Vance was already being drafted in a dozen newsrooms. At the presiding chair, J.D. Vance set down his pen. Are you finished, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary smiled graciously. I believe I've made my points. You have very thoroughly. Vance stood and walked to the front of the dais. And I appreciate your candor. It makes what I'm about to do much easier. Something in his tone made Hillary's smile falter. You've raised questions about my experience, my qualifications, my judgment. You've suggested that I'm not ready for the responsibilities of high office, that I don't understand the weight of decisions that affect American lives. Vance picked up a folder from his desk. So let's talk about experience. Let's talk about judgment. Let's talk about decisions that affect American lives. He opened the folder. Let's talk about Benghazi. The chamber went silent. Hillary's expression hardened. She had known Benghazi might come up. She had prepared responses, the same responses she had given to countless committees, countless reporters, countless hostile questioners over the years. She knew how to deflect, how to reframe, how to make the questioner look partisan and petty. But something in Vance's demeanor was different. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't playing to the cameras. He was methodical, almost clinical, as he spread documents across the desk. September 11, 2012. The American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by armed militants. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were killed. They were the first American ambassador killed in the line of duty since 1979. Vance held up a document. In the months before that attack, the State Department, your State Department, Mrs. Clinton received approximately 600 requests for additional security in Libya. The security situation was deteriorating. Ambassador Stevens himself sent cables warning of the danger. He looked at Hillary. How many of those requests were approved? Hillary's voice was measured. Security decisions were made by professionals within the department based on their assessment. How many were approved, Mrs. Clinton? The Accountability Review Board found that the security posture was. That's not what I asked. Vance's voice sharpened. I asked how many of the 600 requests for additional security were approved. Do you know the answer? Silence. I'll help you, very few. The requests were denied. Some of them, He held up cables, bear your signature, or the signature of officials reporting directly to you. He set down the cables. Ambassador Stevens requested more security. He was denied. He asked again, denied again. He warned that the situation was deteriorating, denied, and then he died. Hillary leaned into her microphone. The security situation in Libya was complex. Let's talk about the night of the attack. Vance pulled out more documents. The assault began at approximately 9:40 p.m. local time. By 10:00 p.m. Washington time, the State Department Operations Center had informed the White House and senior officials that the compound was under attack. He held up an email. At 11:12 p.m., you sent an email to your daughter, Chelsea. The email said, "Two of our officers were killed in Benghazi by an Al-Qaeda-like group." Al-Qaeda. Vance looked at Hillary. You knew that night within hours of the attack that it was terrorism. Al-Qaeda, not a protest, not a spontaneous demonstration, a planned terrorist attack. He set down the email. And yet the next day, and for weeks afterward, you and other administration officials blamed a YouTube video. You said the attack was a spontaneous protest over an anti-Islamic film. You said there was no evidence of a planned terrorist assault. He pulled out another document. On September 14, 2012, 3 days after the attack, you stood at Andrews Air Force Base as the bodies of the 4 Americans were brought home. You spoke to the families. And according to multiple family members, you told them that you would bring the filmmaker to justice. Vance's voice grew harder. Patricia Smith, Sean Smith's mother, has stated publicly, repeatedly, that you told her the video was responsible, that you promised to prosecute the filmmaker. Charles Woods, Tyrone Woods' father, says you told him the same thing. He looked directly at Hillary. You knew it was Al-Qaeda. You wrote that in an email to your own daughter the night of the attack. And then you looked grieving mothers and fathers in the eye and blamed a filmmaker. Why did you lie to them, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary's face had gone pale. The intelligence was still being assessed. There were multiple. You told your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night it happened. What intelligence were you still assessing? You already knew. Vance gathered the Benghazi documents. You lectured me about experience, about the weight of decisions that affect American lives, about the responsibility of high office. He held up the emails, the cables, the security requests. 4 Americans died on your watch because your department denied their security requests. And then you lied to their families about why they died. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your judgment. That's your record. He set down the folder and reached for another. Now let's talk about your emails. Hillary had expected Benghazi. She had weathered Benghazi before, but she could feel something different about this confrontation. A methodical thoroughness that was harder to deflect than the partisan fury she usually faced. Vance opened the new folder with deliberate calm. When you became Secretary of State in 2009, you made an unusual decision. Instead of using the State Department's secure email system, the system designed to protect classified information, you set up a private email server in the basement of your home in Chappaqua, New York. He held up a photograph of the server. This server, maintained by a private company without the security protocols required for government communications, was used for all of your official State Department correspondence. Tens of thousands of emails, 4 years of the nation's diplomacy, on a server in your basement. Hillary shook her head. This has been extensively investigated. It has. Let me tell you what those investigations found. Vance pulled out the FBI report. FBI Director James Comey stated that 110 emails on your server contained classified information at the time they were sent or received. Not retroactively classified. Classified at the time. 110 emails. He turned pages. Of those, 8 email chains contained information classified at the top secret level, the highest level of classification. Information that, if compromised, could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security on an unsecured server in your basement. He looked up. Director Comey described your handling of this classified information as extremely careless. Those were his exact words, extremely careless, not a political opponent. The FBI director. Hillary attempted to respond. Director Kamai also said that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges. That's true. But do you know why, Mrs. Clinton? Vance pulled out more documents. Because proving intent in these cases is difficult. Because the standard for prosecuting a former Secretary of State is different than the standard for prosecuting an ordinary government employee. Because political considerations inevitably affected the decision. He set down the FBI report. But let's be clear about what you did. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information, by storing it on an unsecured private server. If any of the people who work for me had done that, they would have lost their security clearances. They would have been fired. They might well be in prison. Vance pulled out another document. And then there's what happened when you got caught. He held up a subpoena. In March 2015, the House Select Committee on Benghazi issued a subpoena for all emails related to Libya. You were legally required to preserve and produce those documents. He set down the subpoena. Instead, approximately 33,000 emails were deleted. Your staff used a program called BleachBit to ensure they couldn't be recovered. Mobile devices that had contained your emails were destroyed, some of them with hammers. Vance looked at Hillary. Destroying evidence after receiving a subpoena is obstruction of justice, Mrs. Clinton. It's a federal crime. People go to prison for it. He pulled out a video clip transcript. When you were asked about wiping the server, you said, and I quote, "wiped, like with a cloth or something." And then you laughed. He set down the transcript. 33,000 emails subpoenaed by Congress, destroyed with BleachBit and hammers. And you laughed about it. Vance gathered the email documents. You lectured me about judgment, about qualifications, about fitness for office. But you compromised classified information and destroyed evidence under subpoena. You treated national security like a joke, and you've never faced any consequences for it. He set aside the folder. Why do you think that is, Mrs. Clinton? Why do you think ordinary Americans go to prison for mishandling classified information, but you walk free? Could it be that there's one set of rules for the Clintons and another set for everyone else? He reached for the next folder. Let's talk about how you got rich from public service. Hillary Clinton had spent decades building walls around her scandals. Layers of lawyers, friendly media, loyal defenders. She had survived Whitewater, Travelgate, the Rose law firm billing records, her husband's impeachment, Benghazi, the emails. Every time she had emerged battered but intact, convinced that she was simply too big, too important, too protected to be held accountable. But Vance wasn't attacking her walls. He was methodically documenting what was behind them, and the documentation was devastating. The Clinton Foundation, Vance began, opening a new folder. A charitable organization established by your husband after his presidency, officially dedicated to improving global health, fighting climate change, promoting economic development. He pulled out financial records. Between 2001 and 2015, the Clinton Foundation raised approximately $2 billion. $2 billion. From individuals, corporations, and foreign governments around the world. He looked up. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a charitable foundation raising money, but the timing of some of these donations raises questions. Vance spread documents across his desk. You became Secretary of State in January 2009. You were responsible for American foreign policy, including relationships with foreign governments. And during your tenure, the Clinton Foundation received millions of dollars from those same governments. He held up a list. Saudi Arabia, $10 to $25 million. A country where women couldn't drive, where homosexuality is punishable by death, where dissidents are tortured and murdered. They gave your foundation up to $25 million while you were Secretary of State. The United Arab Emirates, $1 to $5 million. Kuwait, $5 to $10 million. Qatar, $1 to $5 million. Oman, $1 to $5 million. All while you were the chief diplomat of the United States. All while these countries had business before your department. Vance set down the list. You lectured me about women's rights. You called my positions prehistoric. But you took tens of millions of dollars from governments that execute women for adultery, that stone women to death for being raped, that treat women as property. He pulled out more documents. And it wasn't just the foundation. Your husband's speaking fees increased dramatically while you were Secretary of State. Bill Clinton received $500,000 from a Russian bank for a single speech while your department was reviewing the sale of American uranium to Russia. He received $750,000 from a Swedish company with business pending before your department. Vance held up a chart. Before you became Secretary of State, Bill Clinton's average speaking fee was approximately $150,000. During your tenure, it jumped to over $500,000, but only for speeches to entities with interests before the State Department. When you left office, the fees dropped back down. He looked at Hillary. That's not coincidence. That's a pricing structure. Access to the Secretary of State cost $500,000 per speech. Hillary's voice was tight. My husband's speaking career has nothing to do with my official duties. Let's talk about Uranium One. Vance pulled out a thick document. In 2010, the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom sought to acquire Uranium One, a Canadian company that controlled approximately 20% of American uranium production. The sale required approval from multiple U.S. agencies, including the State Department. He held up financial records. During the period when this sale was being reviewed and approved, investors in Uranium One donated approximately $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. $145 million. And Bill Clinton received $500,000 for a speech in Moscow, paid by a Russian bank with ties to the Kremlin. While this sale was pending, Vance set down the records. The State Department approved the sale. Russia now controls 20% of American uranium production, and the people involved in that sale gave your foundation $145 million. He leaned forward. You called me a puppet. You suggested I do what I'm told, but you literally sold access to the State Department. You took millions from foreign governments while you were making decisions that affected them. You approved a sale that benefited Russia while Russians were writing checks to your foundation. He gathered the foundation documents. Who's the puppet, Mrs. Clinton? Who's been bought and paid for? He reached for another folder. Now let's talk about how you've treated women. The chamber had grown increasingly tense. Democratic senators who had been beaming during Hillary's attack were now sitting in uncomfortable silence. The narrative they had expected Hillary demolishing the inexperienced hillbilly had been completely inverted. Vance opened his next folder with the same methodical calm he had maintained throughout. Mrs. Clinton, you called me a misogynist. You said my positions on women's rights are prehistoric. You've presented yourself throughout your career as a champion of women, a feminist icon, a defender of those who have been victimized. He pulled out documents. So let's talk about how you've actually treated women. Specifically, the women who accused your husband of sexual misconduct. Hillary's face hardened. My husband is not on trial here. No, he's not. You are, because you weren't a passive bystander to his behavior. You were an active participant in the effort to silence and destroy his accusers. Vance held up the first document. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern who had a sexual relationship with your husband, the President of the United States. According to multiple sources, including leaked conversations, you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune, a young woman, barely out of college, targeted by the most powerful man in the world. And you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. He moved to the next document. Jennifer Flowers. She came forward during the 1992 campaign with evidence of a long-term affair with Bill Clinton. Your campaign's response was to attack her credibility, to dig up dirt on her past, to destroy her reputation. Later, under oath, your husband admitted the affair. But by then, Jennifer Flowers had been publicly humiliated. Paula Jones. She alleged that Bill Clinton had sexually harassed her when he was governor of Arkansas. Your team's response was the same. Attack, discredit, destroy. James Carville, your close ally, said, drag a $100 bill through a trailer park. You never know what you'll find. That was how your team talked about a woman who accused your husband of harassment. Vance's voice grew harder. Kathleen Willey, a White House volunteer who alleged that Bill Clinton had groped her in the Oval Office. After she came forward, she was subjected to an orchestrated campaign of intimidation. Her tires were slashed. Her cat was killed. A stranger approached her while she was jogging and asked about her children by name. He set down the documents. And then there's Juanita Broaddrick. The name hung in the air. Juanita Broaddrick has alleged, consistently, for over 40 years, that Bill Clinton raped her in 1978 when he was Attorney General of Arkansas. She says he bit her lip so hard it bled. She says he told her to put ice on it afterward. Vance pulled out Broaddrick's public statement. She also says that several weeks later, you approached her at a campaign event. She says you grabbed her hand and said, "I just want you to know how much Bill and I appreciate everything you do for us." She says you squeezed her hand painfully and looked her in the eye. She says it was a clear threat. He looked at Hillary. "Did you threaten Juanita Broaddrick, Mrs. Clinton?" Hillary's voice was ice. "That allegation has been investigated." "I didn't ask if it was investigated. I asked if you threatened her. Did you approach a woman who was allegedly raped by your husband and send her a message to stay quiet?" Silence. "You've built your public image on being a champion of women. You've said, 'Believe all women.' But when women accused your husband, you didn't believe them. You attacked them. You hired private investigators to dig up dirt on them. You ran what your own team called a bimbo eruptions operation to silence them." Vance gathered the documents. "That's not feminism, Mrs. Clinton. That's complicity. You enabled your husband's behavior for decades. You helped destroy the women who tried to hold him accountable. And then you had the audacity to present yourself as a champion of women's rights." He set aside the folder. "You called me a misogynist. But I've never attacked a rape victim. I've never hired private investigators to destroy women who accused someone of harassment. I've never threatened a woman to keep her quiet about sexual assault." He looked directly at her. "You have, and everyone watching now knows it." Vance reached for his final major folder. "Let's talk about 2016. Since you brought up my political evolution, let's examine yours." Hillary shifted in her seat. This was the wound that had never healed. The election she had been supposed to win, the presidency she had been denied, the humiliation she had never fully processed. In 2016, you ran for president against Donald Trump. You had every advantage. More money, more endorsements, more media support, more experience. By every conventional measure, you should have won. Vance pulled out documents. "But you didn't win. You lost. And according to your own book, what happened, you've never taken responsibility for that loss." He held up a list. "In your book, you blamed Russia, James Comey, the FBI, Bernie Sanders, the media, sexism, voter suppression, fake news, WikiLeaks, and the vast right-wing conspiracy. You had an explanation for everything except your own failures." He set down the list. "Let's start with how you talked about the voters. On September 9, 2016, at a fundraiser in New York City, you said this about Trump supporters." Vance read from the transcript. "You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, right? The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. You called tens of millions of Americans deplorables, irredeemable, beyond hope, beyond redemption." He looked up. "I grew up with those people, Mrs. Clinton, the people you called deplorables. They're not racists. They're not irredeemable. They're Americans who work hard, love their families, and felt abandoned by politicians like you. Politicians who looked down on them, who dismissed their concerns, who treated them with contempt." Vance pulled out more documents. "And your contempt showed in your campaign. You didn't visit Wisconsin once during the general election. Not once. A state that had voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. You took it for granted. You lost it by 23,000 votes. You barely visited Michigan. You lost it by 11,000 votes. You didn't take Pennsylvania seriously until it was too late. You lost it by 44,000 votes." He set down the documents. 3 states. Fewer than 80,000 votes combined. That's the margin that cost you the presidency. And you lost those votes because you were too arrogant to show up, because you thought you didn't need working-class voters in the Rust Belt, because you called them deplorables and expected them to vote for you anyway. Vance pulled out one more document. And then there's the Steele dossier. Hillary's expression flickered. During the 2016 campaign, your campaign and the Democratic National Committee paid over $1 million to a law firm called Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie hired a company called Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS hired a former British spy named Christopher Steele to compile opposition research on Donald Trump. That research became known as the Steele dossier. It contained sensational allegations about Trump, allegations that have never been verified and many of which have been actively disproven. Vance held up the dossier. But here's what matters. Your campaign paid for this. And then this dossier, this opposition research paid for by your campaign, was used to obtain FISA warrants to surveil American citizens. It was fed to the media before the election. It became the foundation of the Russia collusion narrative that dominated American politics for 4 years. He set down the dossier. The primary source for much of the dossier, a man named Igor Danchenko, was later charged with lying to the FBI about where his information came from. The FBI knew there were problems with the dossier and used it anyway. The entire Russia collusion narrative was built on garbage that your campaign paid for. Vance gathered all the 2016 documents. You accused me of being Trump's puppet. You questioned my principles. But you paid for fake opposition research and then watched as it was used to spy on American citizens and delegitimize an election. You've spent years promoting a narrative you helped create with paid political dirt. He looked at Hillary. That's not principle, that's propaganda, and you've never been held accountable for it. Vance walked to the front of the dais for his conclusion. Mrs. Clinton, you came here today to lecture me about experience, about judgment, about qualifications for high office. You've been doing this for 40 years. Lecturing, condescending, explaining to everyone else how things should be done. He paused. So let's review your experience. Let's see what 40 years of Hillary Clinton has actually produced. He raised one finger. Benghazi. 4 Americans dead because your department denied their security requests. You knew the night of the attack that it was terrorism. You wrote it in an email to your daughter. And then you looked grieving parents in the eye and blamed a YouTube video. You lied to the families of the dead. A second finger. The emails. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information on an unsecured private server. When you were subpoenaed, you destroyed evidence. You had your staff use bleach bit and hammers to ensure the emails couldn't be recovered. Anyone else would be in prison. You laughed about it. A third finger. The foundation. You took tens of millions of dollars from foreign governments while you were Secretary of State. You took money from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from regimes that execute women for being raped. Your husband's speaking fees doubled when entities had business before your department. You sold access to American foreign policy. A fourth finger. Bill's accusers. You presented yourself as a champion of women while spending decades destroying women who accused your husband. You called Monica Lewinsky a narcissistic Looney Tune. You ran a bimbo eruptions team to silence victims. You allegedly threatened a woman who said your husband raped her. A fifth finger. 2016. You called working-class Americans deplorables and irredeemables. You were too arrogant to campaign in states you needed to win. You paid for fake opposition research that was used to spy on American citizens. And when you lost, you blamed everyone but yourself. Vance lowered his hand. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your 40 years in public life. Scandal after scandal, failure after failure. And never, not once, have you taken responsibility for any of it. He walked closer to the witness table. You asked me what I know about foreign policy. I know enough not to get 4 Americans killed and then lie about why. I know enough not to compromise classified information on a server in my basement. I know enough not to take money from governments that stone women to death. You asked about my qualifications. I'm qualified enough not to destroy evidence under subpoena. I'm qualified enough not to sell access to the highest bidder. I'm qualified enough not to blame everyone else when I fail. You called me inexperienced, but your experience is 40 years of scandal, corruption, and failure. That's not a qualification. That's a warning. You called me a hypocrite for changing my views on Trump, but I changed my views openly. I didn't hide it. I explained why. You've spent 40 years hiding evidence, destroying documents, and attacking anyone who questions you. You called me a puppet, but you're the one who sold access to foreign governments. You're the one whose husband's speaking fees depended on what your department was reviewing. You're the one who's been bought and paid for by every special interest with a checkbook. You called me a misogynist, but you're the one who destroyed women to protect your husband's career. You're the one who called a 22-year-old intern a Looney Tune. You're the one who allegedly threatened a rape victim. Vance straightened. You came here today to destroy me, Mrs. Clinton, to remind everyone why you should have been president, to prove that you're still the most formidable figure in American politics. He shook his head. But all you've done is remind everyone why they didn't vote for you, why they don't trust you, why 40 years of Hillary Clinton has left a trail of scandals, lies, and failures that you've never been held accountable for. Some people did something, Mrs. Clinton. They spent 40 years enriching themselves, covering up scandals, destroying anyone who got in their way, and then demanding that America make them president. Those people are you. And today, finally, everyone watching gets to see the full record, not the carefully curated image, not the media-friendly version, the truth. He returned to his seat. I yield my time. The chamber sat in stunned silence. For perhaps the first time in her 40-year public career, Hillary Clinton had been comprehensively, systematically dismantled, not by partisan accusations, but by her own record, documented and presented with devastating thoroughness. She sat motionless at the witness table. The color had drained from her face. Her hands, usually so animated when she spoke, lay flat on the table. Her staff surrounded her, whispering urgently, but she didn't seem to hear them. In the gallery, Bill Clinton sat with his jaw clenched. He had watched many attacks on his wife over the years. He had helped her survive them, but this was different. This wasn't an attack. It was an autopsy. The Democratic senators who had been so eager to see Hillary destroy Vance were now looking at their phones, at their papers, at anything except the witness table. There was nothing to say. No spin that could undo what had just happened. Chairman Menendez attempted to restore normalcy. We'll take a 15-minute recess. No. Hillary's voice was hoarse. I have a response. The room went quiet. Hillary leaned into her microphone. Her hands were trembling slightly, a sight no one had ever seen before. Mr. Vice President, you've delivered quite a prosecution. Very thorough, very well prepared. I can see why you went to Yale Law School. She attempted a smile. It didn't reach her eyes. But everything you've said has been said before. I've faced these accusations for decades. I've been investigated by Congress, by the FBI, by special prosecutors. And I'm still here. Because the accusations don't hold up. Because they're politically motivated. Because... Mrs. Clinton. Vance's voice was quiet but firm. I didn't make accusations. I read documents, your emails, your foundation's financial records, your campaign's FEC filings, the FBI's report, the congressional testimony. He held up the folders. These aren't accusations. They're your own words, your own actions, your own record. If you have an explanation for any of it, an actual explanation, not a deflection, I'm happy to hear it. Hillary stared at him. Why did you tell your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night of Benghazi, and then tell the American people it was a YouTube video? Silence. Why did you destroy 33,000 emails after they were subpoenaed? Silence. Why did the Clinton Foundation accept tens of millions from Saudi Arabia while you were Secretary of State? Silence. Why did your husband's speaking fees double for entities with business before your department? Silence. Why did you call Juanita Broderick's bluff at that campaign event if she was lying? Silence. Vance set down the folders. You've spent 40 years avoiding these questions, Mrs. Clinton, deflecting, blaming your accusers, claiming it's all political, but you've never actually answered them. You've never explained the documents. You've never taken responsibility. He looked at her with something that might have been pity. And now everyone watching knows why. There are no good answers. There's only the record, and the record is damning. Hillary opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, then opened it again. Nothing came out. After a moment, she gathered her papers. Slowly, mechanically, her staff moved to help her rise from the table. The protective entourage that had swept into the chamber 3 hours ago now formed a defensive perimeter, shielding her from the cameras as she walked toward the exit. No one asked questions. What was there to ask? The documents spoke for themselves. As she passed the dais, Vance was organizing his folders, speaking quietly with an aide. He looked up as Hillary passed. Their eyes met. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Mrs. Clinton," he said quietly. "But you attacked my family, my background, my integrity. You opened the door. I just walked through it." Hillary said nothing. She kept walking. She didn't stop until she was in her car, surrounded by tinted glass, away from the cameras that had captured every moment of her humiliation. Only then did she allow herself to understand what had happened. For 40 years she had believed she was untouchable, too powerful, too connected, too important. Every scandal had been weathered, every investigation had been survived, every accuser had been discredited or ignored. But the documents had always been there. The emails, the financial records, the testimony, waiting for someone willing to compile them, organize them, and present them without fear of the Clinton machine. J.D. Vance hadn't been afraid. He had prepared methodically, waited patiently, and struck devastatingly. He had done what 40 years of opponents had failed to do. He had held her accountable. And now her legacy, the carefully constructed narrative of Hillary Clinton, feminist icon, foreign policy expert, most qualified candidate, ever lay in ruins. The video went viral within hours, 120 million views in the first 48 hours. The Reckoning, as the media quickly dubbed it, became the most watched congressional hearing in American history. Clips were shared across every platform. Analysis pieces flooded the internet. The phrase, 40 years of failure, became a meme. The political fallout was swift and comprehensive. The Clinton Foundation, already diminished since 2016, saw its remaining donors flee. Within weeks, the organization announced it was scaling back operations and refocusing its mission. Within months, it was effectively dormant. Democratic politicians who had spent decades cultivating Clinton relationships suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts when asked to appear with her. The Clintons' famous network, built over 40 years of favors, fundraisers, and political IOUs, dissolved almost overnight. The speaking circuit dried up. The boards and commissions that had been eager to add Hillary's name to their letterhead quietly removed her. The elder stateswoman status she had cultivated since 2016 evaporated. Hillary Clinton released a statement through her office. "I am proud of my 40 years of public service and stand by my record. I will continue to advocate for the causes I believe in." But she made no public appearances. She granted no interviews. She had nothing left to say. Bill Clinton, never one to stay silent, attempted a defense on a Sunday talk show. It went poorly. The host simply played clips from the hearing and asked for explanations. Bill's famous verbal dexterity failed him. He rambled. He deflected. He looked old. The Clintons retreated to Chappaqua. Occasionally, photographers would capture them walking on their property or attending a local event. They looked smaller somehow, diminished. The aura of power that had surrounded them for decades was gone. 1 year after the hearing, a documentary about the Clinton era aired on a major streaming service, titled The Reckoning: The Rise and Fall of Hillary Clinton. It featured extensive footage from the Vance hearing, interspersed with interviews and historical analysis. The documentary interviewed former Clinton staffers, some of whom spoke openly for the first time. "We always knew the vulnerabilities were there," one said. "Benghazi, the emails, the foundation. We had responses prepared, but they were deflections, not explanations. We thought if we just kept deflecting long enough, people would move on. They always had before. Another added, the problem was we started believing our own spin. We convinced ourselves that we were the victims, that every accusation was just politics, that we were always right and everyone else was always wrong. We lost the ability to see ourselves clearly. The documentary also interviewed Vance, who reflected on why he had chosen to confront Hillary so directly. She attacked my family, he said simply. She mocked my mother's addiction. She called my story a fraud. She looked down on everything I came from with such obvious contempt. He paused. But honestly, that wasn't why I did it. I did it because someone needed to. For 40 years, the Clintons operated above the rules. Investigations would start, then mysteriously stall. Evidence would disappear. Witnesses would change their stories. The media would lose interest, and nothing would ever happen. I had the documents, I had the platform, I had nothing to lose. She had already attacked me as hard as she could, so I laid out the record. I let the facts speak for themselves. He shrugged. The facts were devastating, not because I framed them unfairly, but because they were true. She lied about Benghazi. She compromised classified information. She sold access through her foundation. She destroyed women to protect her husband. She paid for fake opposition research. None of that was my accusation. It was all documented. I just presented it in one place at one time where she couldn't deflect or change the subject or blame her accusers. The documentary concluded with footage of the Clinton home in Chappaqua, then cut to Vance at his desk in the vice president's office.